an exhibition at Nanda Hobbs, which really delves into the history of landscape painting and the idea of landscape and the meaning associated with landscape through Australian history. Now, it's not only about pictures that have been created in the post-colonial period, but it's also delving into First Nations culture and the way we associate meaning with particular areas of this country. So behind me is an extraordinary painting. Behind me is an extraordinary painting by the great Wenja Morgan. She's an artist who has lived a lot of her life in a little township called Mount Leaving, which is out past Papunya. She's Pintabee, and she is a really extraordinarily detailed artist. And this particular painting is 5 metres long by 2 metres high, and when you delve into it, one of the first things to understand is this incredible texture that's created in the dotting. And that dotting's actually been done with a toothpick, so incredibly laborious work. But for me, it has such an enormous scale and speaks of so many important things to do with actual survival out in that incredibly tough area right out in the middle of Australia. So here we have this fine dotting where she's working away, and through this tonal variation that she creates with the delicate touch of the toothpick, you get almost a shift in tone and colour in the overall landscape. And then these vast rock holes that are so important for the life-giving water. Now, the relationship between this painting and this particular work over here is by Shorty Lukata Drungarai, who was Wenja's father. And he, along with the family, walked to a bore at what is now Mount Leaving. And when they came to the windmill, they'd never seen anything like it before. And we have a photo of that particular site. And for me, it was such an interesting moment because they came out of the desert to find that sort of regular water and food, and into an entirely different landscape and an entirely different world that they would ultimately belong in. And so this particular board by Shorty was done in 1972, and Wenja actually remembers him painting this work, and all of his stories, or most of his stories, related to watercourses and stories around totems that would work in and around and live around that water source. Now, the thing about these works is they're quite instructional, and particularly if you're initiated and understand the lore of the stories, will give you a great deal of information on how to survive. But for Wenja and Shorty, a bigger part of this, apart from creating these incredibly beautiful works, is that it does keep the culture and the mythology alive. And for me, I find that an incredibly powerful moment. So Albert had developed this incredible technique of painting in watercolours and painting his country. And the thing about this landscape is the morphing of tone and colour. For any of you who have been out into the landscape, we think about the interior of Australia as red, but there are many other different colours that change through the day, and the light and the dark, and these incredible purple hues, and they're becoming phenomenally atmospheric. And I think what is interesting about Albert's work is that he really understands that landscape, and he really can see through the landscape. And whilst he's painting in a Western tradition, if you like, it's so much about what he knows about that place that is important in his work. Now, that legacy, as I said, has really come zooming back into the consciousness of Australia. Both contemporary artists like James Drinkwater, and we'll have a look up there, influenced by him, and then all the people that still live out there and have worked for many years in what we sort of loosely term the Hermannsburg School or Many Hands Art Centre, as they now work under. So the other interesting thing about the Hermannsburg artists is that they've really lived in two worlds, very much so for a long time. Hermannsburg was a German mission station right from the 1880s, and so in that time they've lived not only with their own traditional culture but also with a Lutheran Christian influence. Okay, so here we have James Drinkwater, and in 2015 we went for a little trip out into the country, and over the course of that time we visited a couple of the little townships, including Hermannsburg, and he was really taken with not only the sense of history of that place and the fact that Hubert and Albert Namatjira had worked and lived in those places, but also this conversation that I was talking about with the duality of belief systems and how that's influenced people's imaging on the landscape. So Drinkwater, young contemporary Australian painter who really is a bowerbird for motif and moments in time. So he'll grab a symbol of the church, and he'll also grab a tree from the grass trees that are out past Goss Bluff out there, and then a person, a figure in that landscape. And in doing this, it's quite a poetic way of creating an environment and a statement and a new way of looking at the land. So in this little collection here, we've got a work by Paul Ryan, major work from that delves into his muse, which is really the landscape around rural south of Sydney. Now it's an incredibly rugged environment. The weather patterns there change. You have the Pacific Ocean, the south swell, screaming up the coastline, smashing into this coastline, and an enormous escarpment that ricochets right up almost in the beachhead. And the weather changes and there's this mist that rolls in. And it's really, in many respects, the very essence of the sublime. And that's one of the things that we're delving into in this exhibition, because the sublime is really about that idea of something that's incredibly beautiful, incredibly powerful, and also dangerous. And the ocean is, in many respects, that absolute moment where it all comes together. So the inky darkness and this swell and rolling in, and then you see the clouds coming down from the mountains. Now, not only is it a landscape in the tradition of a view or a seascape, if you like, it's not only about that, because Paul Ryan, is really interested in the idea and notion of colonisation and what that actually means in this to this land. So of course the sea was the vehicle, if you like, for the way people came here. And so this roaring ocean pounding into the landscape is actually a metaphor for the coming of colonisation into this country. Next to him, completely different speed, is Adam Nudelman. Now, Adam Nudelman, incredibly detailed, incredibly beautiful painter, based down in Gippsland in Victoria, and he delves very deeply into the Flemish tradition, the Dutch landscape tradition. So for him, paintings are created over many, many months, and what happens in the early layers inform what happens ultimately on the finished paint surface. Paul Ryan, much more intuitive, so he's almost like a samurai swordsman in the way he actually moves paint around, and intuitively creating the violence of the ocean or the beauty of the mountains. Drinkwater, every blade of grass investigated, and the glow of his paintings really inform the sense of the allegorical nature of his stories. His structures that appear in something a little darker than that. But he wants you to challenge yourself to find your own stories, and in many respects, find the stories of this country in his work. Now, wandering over here with two works by Nicholas Blowers, Tasmanian-based artist who grew up in the UK in Essex and learned his craft and skill in a very British tradition of fine craftsmanship and really beautiful, evocative landscapes. And there's also Fred Williams on the wall here as well. He's one of the great landscape painters. And the thing about Fred Williams, which is quite well known, whilst he's one of the most powerful landscape painters, certainly in the 20th century, I've always believed that his playing around with that landscape has changed the way we look at it. And for him, there are so many incredible vistas and views and incredibly powerful landscapes, but he was more interested in those minor moments of the landscape. And I think there's a really interesting conversation between Fred Williams and Nicholas Blowers here. Nicholas is an artist that is very interested in the way man investigates and changes the landscape, and how the landscape battles back. And so he spent a lot of time on the west coast of Tasmania, which has been ravaged by mining and all sorts of different man-made activities, and he really revels in that beauty that can be created as nature, if you like, starts to wrestle back control of a landscape. So there's Arthur Boyd, Hunters from 1966, and Laura Matthews, it's a painting of Flinders Island. And these sit really well together in a fairly intense way. Arthur Boyd, who was incredibly clever in the way he would delve into allegorical stories, whether they be ancient classical mythology and or biblical references. In this work, for me, it's incredibly interesting the way the landscape, the people, and the beasts that sort of roam and the story that he's telling morph together. And as we talk about in the catalogue, how we're looking through almost looking through a curtain, and it's not as if the activity is happening in front of the landscape. It is the landscape. It's all the one thing, and that's an interesting shift where we're not trying to portray an activity in front of a landscape. We're actually incorporating the figures into that environment. So these heads around the creek that rolls through are almost like rocks, and the horns of the beast up here echoing the trees, and then the way the whole thing's been treated is like a tapestry. It's fantastic. But what's interesting, to put it next to Laura Matthews, who again another British trained artist, incredibly sensitive in her approach to the landscape and the way light plays around in the landscape. And this is of Flinders Island. Flinders Island has particularly tragic history when it comes to the Tasmanian Aborigines. So after the occupation, the colonial occupation, ultimately a lot of the Aborigines were rounded up and placed on Flinders Island at a place called Waitalina for their own protection. It was so called their own protection. The tragedy being that ultimately the vast majority of them died of either illness or, in a very real sense, a broken heart of not being in their own land. And it was a tragic place. And having wandered around Waitalina, it is an incredibly dark place, but it is an incredibly beautiful place too, in the sense of what a landscape is about, and aptly captured. But I think having the trials of those people that were moved there in the early 1800s, really echoed with some of the ideas that Boyd was delving into, and with his incredibly important series, the Bride series in the 50s and 60s. So I'm really excited to see how these two works sit together. Just on this other wall here, we have 3 works, one by Aaron Kinane, who's really looking at the pastoral landscape, and that's a very important part of the landscape tradition, the beautiful landscape. So landscape doesn't always have to be awe-inspiring, doesn't always have to be dark and tough. It can be beautiful, it can be harmonious, and Aaron really looks at that with a stripped back palette. He's working through, and again in a very viscous way, what happens in the past moments in the canvas. You'll see the flecks of red and all these sort of things. He works the layers up and creates a very atmospheric moment, and the horizon line shifting and changing. Now he's north of Newcastle, and it is an incredibly idyllic landscape where the pastoral meets the mountains and the big skies as well. So and very strongly centred in a spirit of place. We also had Greer Shed, who was the recipient of the first Nolan Trust scholarship in the UK, and that's when she went there about 2 years ago. She discovered rediscovered her love of en plein air painting, so painting outside, the freshness and dappling of light and tone and all of those things that are such an important part, not only to the way we look at landscape. So whenever you're out there painting and making these things, it's really important that moment in time where you're capturing the light, and in this work you can see that investigation into the landscape. And above is Black Douglas, who we showed at the back end of last year, and this is the last of the paintings in the series that he worked around, which was part of the 250th anniversary of Cook's Landing on what we call Botany Bay. And you can see that he's using the statue of Cook and appropriating different text around that, and also pointing to the ultimate tragedies that unfolded with colonisation. Now, the interesting thing about Black Douglas is not really what we would class an iconoclast, where he's talking about ripping down these statues. He's much more around the idea of actually having a duality, celebrating a First Nations culture that has existed and in so many ways has been marginalised and not celebrated. So, and I think this is one of the things that we need to think about in the landscape. And if we come back over to Wenjit to finish up, when we think about what's important about this country, about the land, about the vastness of it, the fact that this incredible artist who grew up in the sand dunes and could create a work that speaks so much of this landscape and so much of this country, and does it in a language, a visual language, which is entirely different from the European way of working, but speaks of the same thing, is so important. So that is what we're really pushing our minds, or trying to bring our minds around with this exhibition, about place, about what it means to be in this country, and what it means to really delve into when we look at a landscape, when we look at a site, what is inherently there beyond just the view.